There is a pattern that has repeated itself across 2,000 years of human civilization. It destroyed Rome. It bankrupted Spain. It collapsed the British Empire. And right now, in 2025, every major power on Earth is following the exact same sequence, step by step, warning sign by warning sign. The pattern is simple. An empire grows powerful. It overspends. It borrows to cover the gap. It can't repay what it owes, so it debases the currency, hoping no one notices. Inflation follows. Trust erodes. And then, inevitably, collapse. Rome proved this pattern with the denarius. Spain proved it with silver. Britain proved it with the pound. And today, the United States, China, Japan, France, and the United Kingdom are all trapped in the same spiral that destroyed every empire before them. But here's what makes 2025 different from any previous moment in history. This isn't happening to one empire, it's happening to all of them simultaneously. Global public debt has reached $111 trillion. That's 94.7% of the entire world's economic output. 23 countries now owe more than their entire GDP. 2 countries owe more than double what their economies produce in a year. And more than 3.4 billion people live in nations where interest payments on government debt exceed spending on education or healthcare. The debt spiral has gone global, and the tools that saved previous generations from financial catastrophe have already been exhausted. This is the story of how Rome's final mistake became the world's current policy. Let's start with the original case study, the Roman denarius. When Rome first minted the denarius around 211 BC, it contained 4.5 grams of pure silver. For nearly 300 years, this coin held its value. When you received a denarius, you knew exactly what you were getting: real silver, real purchasing power. This created the trust that allowed Rome to fund its legions, build its roads, and administer an empire spanning 3 continents. But empires are expensive. The military demanded payment. The people demanded bread and circuses. And eventually, Rome was spending more than it collected in taxes. The logical solution would have been to cut spending or raise taxes. Instead, Emperor Nero did something else entirely. In 64 AD, he reduced the silver content of the denarius from pure silver to just 93.5%. He also reduced the weight. With the same amount of silver, the mints could now produce more coins. More coins meant more spending power for the government. Problem solved. Except it wasn't solved. It was just beginning. By the time Septimius Severus ruled, around 200 AD, the denarius had dropped to roughly 50% silver. His son Caracalla introduced a new coin called the Antoninius, supposedly worth 2 denarii, but containing only 1.5 times the silver. Classic government mathematics. By the reign of Gallienus in the 260s, the denarius contained less than 5% silver. What had been a pure silver coin was now essentially a bronze token with a thin silver wash.
The results were predictable. Prices exploded. What cost 1 denarius in the time of Augustus cost dozens of debased denarii by the 3rd century. Soldiers demanded payment in gold or goods rather than worthless coins. Farmers stopped selling food for currency and returned to barter. Tax collection became nearly impossible because the currency the government demanded had no real value. The entire economic system seized up. This wasn't caused by foreign invasion. Rome's borders were still defended. This wasn't caused by plague or natural disaster. This was self-inflicted. The Roman government destroyed its own currency to fund spending it couldn't afford. And when the currency died, the empire died with it. By 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire officially collapsed, not because Germanic tribes were militarily superior, but because Rome could no longer pay its armies, maintain its infrastructure, or administer its provinces. The currency had been debased into irrelevance, and everything built on that currency crumbled along with it. The pattern had been established. Military overspending leads to deficit spending. Deficit spending leads to currency debasement. Currency debasement leads to inflation. Inflation leads to loss of confidence. Loss of confidence leads to collapse. Now fast forward to 2025. The United States federal government just paid $970 billion in interest on its national debt in fiscal year 2025 alone. That's nearly $1 trillion that didn't build a single road, fund a single school, or pay a single soldier. It just serviced the debt on previous spending. Interest payments are now the third largest line item in the federal budget, behind only Social Security and Medicare. They exceed defense spending. They exceed Medicaid. They exceed veterans' benefits, food assistance, and transportation combined. And it's accelerating. The Congressional Budget Office projects interest payments will reach $1.8 trillion per year by 2035. Over the next decade, the government will pay $13.8 trillion just in interest, not principal. Interest. That's roughly $40,500 for every person in America, spent on nothing except servicing debt accumulated by previous generations. The national debt now exceeds $38 trillion. It grew by $2.2 trillion in just the past year. At current rates, it's growing by roughly $69,000 per second. Every second you spend listening to this, the debt increases by another $69,000. But the United States isn't alone. Japan's debt stands at $9.8 trillion, representing 230% of GDP. China's debt has reached $18.7 trillion, growing by $2.2 trillion in just 2025 alone. The United Kingdom and France each carry roughly $4 trillion in government debt. France has cycled through 5 prime ministers in the past 2 years, largely due to political instability caused by budget battles. Italy sits at 137% of GDP. Even Germany, traditionally Europe's fiscal anchor, is seeing its debt trajectory deteriorate as it increases defense and infrastructure spending.
Destructive war in human history. Once the war ended, economies could grow their way out. Today, debt is high with no end in sight. No war to conclude, no obvious path to reduction, just perpetual borrowing to fund perpetual deficits. This brings us to Rome's final mistake, the mistake every empire makes right before the end. When you can't tax enough and you can't cut spending, there are only 2 options: default on the debt or debase the currency. No government willingly chooses default, so they all choose debasement. For Rome, debasement meant reducing the silver content of coins. For modern governments, debasement means printing money. Different mechanism, identical outcome. Between 2020 and 2022, the Federal Reserve created over $4 trillion in new money. They called it quantitative easing. They said it was necessary to stabilize the economy during the pandemic, and maybe it was. But the consequence was the same as when Nero reduced the silver in the denarius. More currency, chasing the same goods, means higher prices. Inflation hit 9% in 2022, the highest in 40 years. The Federal Reserve then raised interest rates to combat inflation. This worked to reduce price increases, but it created a new problem. Higher interest rates mean higher borrowing costs for the government. When rates were near zero, the government could borrow cheaply. Now, with rates elevated, every new dollar of debt costs significantly more to service. The average interest rate on federal debt has more than doubled in just 5 years. And here's the trap. The government can't reduce the debt without crashing the economy. Modern economies depend on continuous credit expansion. If the government suddenly stopped borrowing and started paying down debt, the money supply would contract. Businesses would fail. Unemployment would spike. we would enter a depression worse than the 1930s. So the debt must keep growing, which means interest payments must keep growing, which means the government must borrow more just to pay the interest on previous borrowing. It's a spiral that feeds on itself. Rome experienced this exact dynamic. They couldn't stop debasing the currency because the economy had become dependent on the inflated money supply. Every emperor who tried to restore sound money caused economic disruption, leading to their replacement by an emperor who would resume debasement. The pattern today is identical across every major economy. China is struggling with a collapsing property market and local government debts exceeding $13 trillion. They're responding with stimulus spending, funded by more borrowing. Japan has maintained debt at 230% of GDP by keeping interest rates near zero. But this requires the central bank to buy government bonds constantly, which is simply money printing by another name. Their new prime minister is proposing another $92 billion in stimulus, even as debt remains at historic highs. France can't pass a budget because any meaningful spending cuts trigger political crisis. The United Kingdom is trying to balance major social obligations against tightening fiscal conditions. Both countries are projected to see debt ratios continue rising through the end of the decade.
Every major economy is making Rome's final mistake simultaneously. They're all debasing their currencies to fund spending they can't afford through taxes. They're all accumulating debt faster than their economies can grow. They're all paying increasing portions of their budgets just to service interest. And they're all hoping somehow the math will work out differently than it did for Rome. But math doesn't change across centuries. You cannot spend more than you earn forever. You cannot print prosperity. You cannot debase your currency without consequences. Every empire that has tried has failed. Rome failed. Spain failed. Britain failed. The only question is how long the current system can continue before the same consequences arrive. The warning signs are flashing. Global debt exceeding $111 trillion. Interest payments consuming ever larger shares of government budgets. 55 countries assessed at high or distressed levels of fiscal risk by the IMF. Central banks holding trillions in government bonds that were purchased with newly created money. The parallel to Rome is precise. Just as Roman emperors reduced silver content by small amounts, hoping no one would notice, modern governments are debasing currencies gradually through inflation, hoping the process is slow enough that citizens don't revolt. Just as Roman soldiers eventually demanded payment in gold or goods rather than worthless denarii, modern investors are increasingly questioning the value of government bonds. Just as Roman tax collection collapsed because no one wanted worthless currency, modern governments are finding it harder to fund operations without resorting to more borrowing. And just as Roman citizens watched their savings evaporate as prices rose, modern citizens are watching inflation erode their purchasing power while wages fail to keep pace. The question is not whether the pattern will complete. History shows it always does. The question is timing. How long until interest payments consume so much of government budgets that essential services fail? How long until inflation becomes uncontrollable? How long until confidence breaks? Rome's currency debasement took over 2 centuries to fully destroy the empire. But the modern global economy is more interconnected, more leveraged, and more dependent on debt than Rome ever was. When Rome's currency failed, it affected the Roman Empire. When the dollar, yen, euro, yuan, and pound all face stress simultaneously, it affects the entire world. The debt spiral that destroyed Rome is now operating at global scale. Every major power is making Rome's final mistake at the same time. And the tools that might slow the spiral, sound fiscal policy, higher interest rates, spending cuts, are politically impossible in most democracies and economically destabilizing even if attempted. Rome's emperors couldn't stop the debasement because the alternative was immediate crisis. Modern leaders face the same trap. The alternative to continued borrowing is immediate recession. The alternative to money printing is immediate deflation. The alternative to low
Interest rates is immediate government funding crisis. So they continue the policies that destroyed Rome, hoping somehow the outcome will be different. It won't be different. The mathematics are the same. The pattern is the same. Only the scale has changed. The denarius went from pure silver to worthless bronze over 2 centuries. Modern currencies are following the same path in compressed time frames. The dollar has lost over 95% of its purchasing power since the Federal Reserve was created in 1913. The process is identical, only the speed varies. Rome's final mistake wasn't any single decision. It was the accumulation of small decisions, each seemingly rational in isolation, that led inevitably to collapse. A small reduction in silver content here, an increase in military spending there, one more debasement to fund one more crisis. Today's governments are making the same small decisions. One more stimulus package, one more round of quantitative easing, one more trillion in debt. Each decision seems manageable in isolation. Together, they form the pattern that destroyed Rome, Spain, Britain, and every empire that believed it was different. The hidden debt spiral isn't hidden anymore. It's documented in IMF reports. It's visible in interest payment statistics. It's obvious in inflation data. Every major power is now following Rome's final mistake. The only variable is how long until they reach Rome's final outcome. History has watched this pattern destroy empires for 2,000 years. The pattern doesn't care about American exceptionalism. It doesn't care about Japanese financial engineering. It doesn't care about Chinese growth targets or European Union rules. The pattern is mathematical, and mathematics does not negotiate. Rome debased the denarius, the empire fell. And right now, every major power on earth is doing the same thing, at the same time, on a scale Rome's emperors couldn't have imagined. The hidden debt spiral has gone global, and history suggests we already know how this story ends.